Hey friends, welcome to the HealthSimple Show. I'm your host, Kyle Reedhead, and I interview health and wellness experts from around the world to help you live healthy, happy, and stress-free. Now don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and if you have any questions about anything we talk about through this episode, just comment below and I'll get back to you as soon as possible. Enjoy the show. All right, hello everybody, and welcome back to HealthSimple Radio. This is episode number 42, and we have Dan Debaun here with us, who is the founder of Defender Shield. So, Dan, welcome to the show, first of all.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me, Kyle. Appreciate it.
Of course. Now, can you give us a little bit of a background of who you are, and just so the listeners know, we're going to talk about EMF. If you haven't heard of it, don't worry. You're going to learn all about it here in this episode. Very interesting topic. So, Dan, give us a little bit of background of where you come from.
Well, let's first start by saying that a year or two ago, I was a co-author on Radiation Nation. It's a book that talks about modern technologies and the emissions that are from those technologies. It's the fallout of modern technology, as we like to put it. But what prompted that was several years ago, I ran technical laboratories for the Bell system, and then quite serendipitously got involved in this kind of technology space because my wife wanted grandchildren. My sons were using their laptops on their laps for hours at a time. And my wife says, that can't be good for you. And I, of course, had background in technology. So I said to my wife, that's just not true. The energy levels are too low for it to be bothersome to the body. Mm-hmm. But I did look into it a little bit. And what I found was, to my surprise, there was very serious and clear evidence, even back then, that there was potential dangers to the emissions that are around us all day. So that prompted me to start a company that actually provides shielding. And what happened was I built it for my sons, and they actually began using it, and then they gave it to their friends, and so on and so forth. And all of a sudden, we're running a company that provides shielding to those who use devices near their body. And oh, by the way, I still don't have grandchildren 5 years later. So
I'm sure that the wife isn't too happy about that.
Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, we have to have dogs to keep us happy.
Yeah, my parents are doing the same thing. It's funny. You basically started a company by accident.
Yeah.
But I mean, it's solving a big problem that's happening today that I think a lot of people have no idea even exists, yet right. It affects so many. And I know myself, I've used my laptop on my lap for hours on end since college, really. And
right.
so
yeah, exactly.
When I came across your work, it really kind of spiked something in me that, hey, I got to change because this is not good. So can you explain a little bit about what EMF actually is? Because it can be a little bit of a confusing topic for people, but I think hopefully we can simplify it a bit here and make sure that people really understand, what's going on here.
Okay. I'll tell a little bit of a story. 30 years ago, I was in Bell Labs, and we had these huge mainframes that were just coming about at that time, and they were emitting a whole lot of things into the environment. But I was safe because I was 200 feet away from the equipment, and I was at an acoustical coupling connecting to a mainframe. And so I was not being emitted. So the emissions that were occurring from electronics, it wasn't near my body. Mm-hmm. Fast forward, maybe for the last 10 years or so, we've had these small little devices in our pockets, on our laps, on our ears. And so it's funny how the strength of the computers that were on the mainframes 20, 30 years ago are now in my hand. And there are also emissions coming out of them that are no longer far distance, they're touching my body. And so what are those kinds of technologies that are around us that are generating emissions? So literally household current, the things you plug into a wall, motors, fans, hair dryers, toasters, they all emit extreme low frequency emissions. They're a byproduct of the power of being consumed. There's these low level emissions up to 300 kilohertz that actually emit into the room. And most of the time they're okay, because when you're a little bit of a distance away from those kinds of things, it's pretty safe. And then you have the laptop, the tablet, the cell phones. And a cell phone, you have a connection to a cell tower, you have a connection to your Wi-Fi, you have a connection to your Bluetooth. And then, so you have all these emissions coming out of those little devices. They're low-level emissions, but they're microwave emissions. They're radio frequency emissions. So what do I mean by that? Here's an example. When you use a microwave oven and you put a piece of meat inside a microwave oven and you turn it on, the signal from the microwave hits the water between the cells of your body, and they oscillate the cells. And that's what cooks your meat, is oscillating cells from an energy that's a microwave at 2.3, about 2.3 gigahertz. Your cell phone works at about 2 gigahertz. So what you're using to connect to your cell tower is a microwave signal that is known to be a thermal and a biological impacting source. Even though it's at a low level, if you think about it, when you walk into an environment today in our rooms, your whole room is full of these sources. You have the cell towers near you, you have your neighbor Wi-Fi, you have your own Wi-Fi, you have your laptop, tablet, and cell phone right next to you, all of them having many forms of emission. So all of a sudden you're getting in your environment a whole lot of stuff that 10 years ago didn't exist.
So this EMF that's coming off of these devices, is it just coming off and it's taking over the entire room? Is it just close to the device? How does that work?
That's a good question, Kyle. When you think of this, think of your finger, and there's a tiny little ball that's beginning to emerge out, gets built bigger and bigger and bigger. On a cell phone, it can go up to 5 miles, and it's an omnidirectional signal. It's going in all directions, and it's emanating from your cell phone. Any of those sources emanate into the entire room. So when you have a cell phone and you have Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and cellular connection, you have 3 emitting sources, omnidirectional, that are going in all directions into your environment.
Wow. And this is happening not just from our cell phones, this is happening from our Wi-Fi router that's around. This is happening from all these devices that are plugged in.
Yeah.
Wow. And
your clock, you plugged into a wall, that's constantly emitting because it has a little motor inside. Your refrigerator that you have your food being cooked in.
I'm currently wearing Bluetooth headphones. I assume that's going to be
Bluetooth headphones. Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna delve into that comment a little bit prematurely, but I want the point to make because I think it was a good point. A cell phone has 1.6 watts per kilogram of power. The energy level is strong enough to go 5 miles at that frequency for that extent, 1.6. If you're a concussed individual where there's no blood-brain barrier in your brain protecting your brain cells, a 0.1 watts, 15 times less power level, can actually influence the cell of your brain because it's a soft tissue. So 0.1, 15 times less than a 1.6 watts per kilogram. Well, when you use Bluetooth, it's 0.3 watts per kilogram. So even though it's really, really small, there's a potential health impact, because we know from science that even the lowest of levels over a long period of time can be an exposure that may have damaging effects to your body. So to answer your question, you put a Bluetooth into your ears and you're listening to music for 6 hours, that's not necessarily a good thing to the brain, particularly if you're concussed.
$200 on these Bluetooth headphones. Well, okay, we'll talk more about the specific devices and which ones are personal. Kind of near the end, we'll get more practical. I want to talk about, I want to apply this and go, what does this actually mean for us? So how does this EMF actually affect our body? Is it down to the cellular level? What's it doing to us?
There's many things it does. Over the last 5 years or so, there's been a lot of research that talks about the impact to the cell. Like, for example, we were talking about my wife wanting grandchildren. Well, after about 4 hours of a laptop in your lap, 25% of your sperm is immobile. So, and there's long-term potential damage if those excessive exposures are long. So there's those transient things that can occur. You may get a headache, a neurological impact. You may have dizziness slightly. You may have fogginess in your thinking, very slight. So there's those like kinds of temporary impacts when you're really associated close to those devices. But then there's the more long-term, as I was mentioning before. We know a cell itself under an RF signal can actually mutate and be a modified cell. We actually know the breakdown of the cell as a result of that exposure. And to reinforce that, there's actually been several studies in the US, one large study, National Toxicology Program, that spent $25 million. And they had an epidemiology study in which they compared populations and they looked for failures directly from those exposures. And what they found was that there was an elevated increase, a significant finding. In other words, that's a scientific term that says it's really real. And what they found was that there was increase in frontal lobe cancers and there was increase in heart cancers. So we know from that research, plus worldwide research, Ramazani Institute out of Italy, they did the same, almost the identical study with the almost identical same results. So what we know with lots of study work and lots of replicated findings, that there can be damage to the cell and it can be serious. Those kinds of things are known as the cell impact. We know also that there's like 4,500 system functions in the body. And believe it or not, if those systems are weakened, and we'll talk a little bit about why they're weakened, but if they're weakened, they actually can be impacted. For example, I know you sit down and you go to bed at night, you put your head on the pillow and you have your cell phone right next to you. I bet you do. Well, guess what? 20% or so of people actually can't go to sleep because it's screwing around with the process of creating the melatonin for your head. So that's one of the reasons why you really don't want these things real close for a long duration, because we know system body functions are impacted. So it can be temporary and it can be more seriously permanent. So there's a large variety of kinds of impacts it can have on the body.
Now, there's still a bit of controversy about the research on this, and I mean it's understandable. One, it's new; it's something that we're just kind of learning about, and two, it's not an easy thing to study, I would assume.
Oh yeah,
can you?
And typically it takes over 30 years when stuff is introduced in our environment, and then we understand it. for example, in 1978, I think it was, the chairman of Philip Morris was in front of a physician group, a pediatrician's physician group. And they asked, is it a problem if a pregnant woman smokes cigarettes? And he said, absolutely not. And then he thought about it a little bit and he said, oh, wait a minute though. The baby's going to be born smaller potentially. And what woman wouldn't want a smaller baby? 1978. That was the mentality then. Of course, we all know it causes cancer and a variety of other things. It took a long time for us to learn that. Trans fats, I know you're into the food space. Trans fats that we had 30 years in our environment. A lowly biochemist said, it's not the eggs that are killing us. It's the trans fats that we're using to cook the food. The trans fats that we're putting into our margarine so it spreads easier. And sure enough, it took over 30 years for it to ultimately be banned in the US. I believe that what you're seeing with electromagnetic radiation is that the same model. It's consistent. It takes a long time for us to understand it. By the way, when I smoked at 12 years old, quite a number of years ago, I often point out I wanted to be a big man, but the general public never knew anything about the connections to cigarette smoking and cancer. But research knew it at that time. It just wasn't generally available, market understood. We knew it. So is that true today with electromagnetic radiation? Yes. We have research, very large, significant research that's pointing the finger to problems that we have in our environment that we're creating. And so I believe that it's controversial. It often depends on which side of the fence you're on, but it's not an unusual debate to have if you look at the historical parallels.
Well, and I agree, and it seems like EMF is kind of the new smoking, right? It took, as you just said, with trans fats and everything else, it took a while for us to realize that, hey, smoking is bad. And part of the reason for that was because the companies that sell you cigarettes were lobbying against it. We're trying to hide the research. Is this sort of thing happening with devices?
Oh, absolutely. I'm going to tell you two stories. The first story is I was in the telecommunications for many years, as I talked about in the introduction. So I knew a lot of people. One of them is he's the head of the largest wireless cell phone, one of the largest wireless cell phones in the world, in the US, if not in the world. And he saw products I build. And he said, I love your products, but I can never use them because if I begin using them, I'm going to substantiate the fact that they could potentially be dangerous. So that caught me off guard a bit when I heard that. And here's another more sinister view. There was, in the US, we have the FCC. They're the governing body that establishes standards in the industry that all of us have to abide in telecommunications. That man, Wheeler is his name, over 30 years ago, was the chairman and head of the CTIA, a consortium responsible for representing the service providers, the cell phone service providers. Fast forward to about 6 years ago, he became the head of the FCC, establishing the standards for the industry, almost like putting a fox in the hen house. But literally true. Politics is still as strong as ever.
Is it ever? So do we have standards? Are they any good for the devices that we have, or are we kind of missing out here?
I keep on going back 30 years ago. 30 years ago, the FCC went and they got data about the average 6-foot male. And they said, we want to know how strong the signal level needs to be on a cell phone. And so we're going to take that 6-foot male average and we're going to establish a standard so we protect that individual. What they did was they said 1.6 watts per kilogram will penetrate a male's head by 1 inch, and it will heat it up by 2 degrees. Remember we talked about it, it's a microwave? It heats up the cells. That's what it does. So that's what the standard was, set back over 30 years ago. So fast forward to today, you have a child that's 6 years old using a cell phone. What's going on? That same 1.6 watts per kilogram is not going an inch into the head. It's going all the way through the head of a child. And all they worried about was the thermal impact, how much heat was being created, never the biological. And of course, it is more concerning about the biological impacts, not the thermal impacts. The biological is where you have mutated cells, DNA damaged cells. It's the impact to the 4,500 processes of the body that's being impacted. And so those are biological, and the standard never reflected that.
So it's not about the heat that these devices are causing. Because I mean, you put your laptop on your lap for a while, it gets really hot.
Right.
But that's not. I mean, that's part of it, but that's a whole
Right.
different scenario.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
It's a different thing that's actually causing a lot of the issues.
Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. So it's affecting.
And funny, by the way, when you said it, you feel it in your lap, the heat in the lap. That heat can be two things. It's the emissions of heat that's being thrown off you with the fans in the laptop, or it can be the increase based on the transmission of the RF signal to the Wi-Fi. It's because it's a thermal emitting signal. It's increasing the temperature of that body part. And by the way, those are the most dangerous, most susceptible body parts. The heart, the groin, and the brain are the softest parts of the body. Those are where there's most danger. When you have friends that are using cell phones and they say, God, I get hot when I use my cell phone. It's heating up. So that's one of the canaries in the coal mine kind of thing. If it's heating up, it's not good for you.
And if you think about where we put our devices, most is the groin, the pocket, the heart there. If you got a suit jacket on, or you're going to be on the phone up to here. So the three worst spots. Now, we
don't naturally do that, right?
Is it affecting children much more than it would be an adult then? Is that what you were suggesting earlier?
Actually, it's not just only a suggestion, it's a fact. The fact that it goes all the way through is disconcerting in and of itself. But also the fact is, because it's all soft tissue, the bones are not been mature enough. They're not resistive to penetration. A child is 3 times more susceptible than an adult male, adult female for that matter. So it's like we have these exposures to kids playing little games on tablets with their connection to the Wi-Fi, and they're being exposed to these signals, and they're absorbing 3 times of what you would absorb. Wow. Is that good?
Yeah, no, not at all.
Right.
It's crazy. So obviously there's things that we can do to sort of limit our exposure or to help with this, but is there anything that is happening right now in the laws or that institutions are doing to sort of help? Because you think about it and, you say that it's way worse in kids, but you look at the way that schools are going and they're all getting tablets in their schools. The kids are all going there with cell phones, Wi-Fi all throughout. Is there any change happening?
It depends on what part of the world you're in.
Okay.
I'll start off by saying that the World Health Organization considers RF to be carcinogenic, like arsenic. So they've already labeled it as a toxin in our environment, just like arsenic would be. The only reason they didn't talk about it in terms of a pure carcinogenic is because there was not enough data. And recently, with the study work from the Royal Mazzani Institute and the NTP, we expect that the World Health Organization is going to declare it a cancer. So we have those kinds of activity going on. Europe tends to be far more aggressive. There are some countries that don't allow Wi-Fi in the classroom. Really? They don't, in fact, for that matter, cell phones or any other device, because of the potential dangers. They seem to be far more advanced in Europe in terms of understanding of the population than the US is. In the US, as you can imagine, there's a conflict, a political conflict that's occurring all the time. And that conflict will continue. My guess is, and even though we have standards that are coming up from the FCC, we have these counter arguments that are going on by the other politicians. The senator from Connecticut, I believe it was, recently questioned the FCC and said, you just approved 5G, which is another generation of technology, and you've proven there's no evidence that it's safe. So we have some of that stuff going on. In fact, 5G was approved under Wheeler, the CTIA guy. He approved it, and it's up to 300 gigahertz, which is really, really fast stuff. And I can explain that a little bit later. But so that is actually occurring. But I'll go back to smoking. When did it become common knowledge that there was a cancer link? It was when they started losing in court. We knew the science had it at that time. Yeah. But ultimately, it was when we began seeing this stuff in court. And I can still remember when it was, the stamp on the packaging of cigarettes, warning, it's bad for you. And we have just begun having law cases in which the cell phone industry is losing. Italy recently, where one man passed away from cell phone, was concluded to be cell phone emissions, and he won a large award. I believe that's what's going to be prompting the change more and more. The more we make noise, the more likely it's true that we're going to get evidence-based or approvals.
When I was reading the book Radiation Nation, which is an awesome book, by the way, if you want to learn about EMF, this gives absolutely everything you need to know. But I was interested to see that Lakehead University here in Canada has banned Wi-Fi on campus.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe, I just couldn't even imagine going to school without Wi-Fi. But hey, good move, right? I mean, it's obviously the way that we need to go. It's kind of going, back to the way that it used to be, but it makes sense. I mean, if that's what you got to do, then that's really what we have to do.
Yeah, believe it or not, in Canada, they seem to be a bit more aggressive at trying to understand this. There was a Dr. Trower is his name. He's out of the UK. He developed war devices that are RF signal devices. And so when you transmit this signal at a power level, it can disarm you using certain technology to do that. Well, he was actually in Canada quite often talking about the guns in the room. You are radiating your children with technologies I developed in the UK to defend ourselves from our enemies, and you have it in the classroom. And so Canada seems to be a little bit more rebellious than the US right now, which I'm really happy to see, because quite honestly, we just don't know what the long-term impacts of a cell phone going to a child's head all the way through.
Yeah.
We just don't know.
So let's look at some of the devices and sort of, give some practical information to the listeners. What kind of devices? I mean, obviously there's some EMF coming from every device, but we can't just go back to no devices. We're not going to go back to the 1800s.
Right, exactly.
So are there ones that we should be more concerned about? Or can you sort of discuss that?
Yeah. There's one really important cardinal rule. The fact is that the power level of 1.6 watts per kilogram touching the head is the worst it can be. If you take it one foot away, 80% of the cell danger is gone, 98% at 4 foot. So as a general rule of thumb, if you're not using it, move it away from you by at least 4 foot or more. And of course, if you have your devices like a cell phone and it has Bluetooth, Wi-Fi, and cell phone cell connection, and you don't use Wi-Fi and you don't use Bluetooth, turn them off. You don't need them. So you're reducing the magnitude of that emissions within the room simply by managing those devices. The other major important message is this time, duration. If you use it 5 minutes a day, you're not going to pass away from cell phone radiation. If you use it 5 hours a day, you increase the probability of being more permanent damage. So time and distance, they're your real friends. And they're very, very simple things to do. And when you're not using something, turning it off, moving it away is a great idea. Now, Wi-Fi. If you have a Wi-Fi on, particularly if it's near your bedroom, and we'll talk about this a little bit in a minute, but if it's a Wi-Fi, I have a timer on mine. It turns it off at 10 o'clock at night when I go to bed, and at 7 o'clock it turns it on. I little time, so I don't have it on at night. So I'm not populating my environment with potentially dangerous signals. I had one person I was talking to, and they were being very, very pleasant to me. They said, what should I do in my bedroom? And I said, well, don't ever have these devices near you because it screws around with your melatonin and all sorts of stuff. And she was very polite, and she said, oh, that's good to know. And I said, turn the Wi-Fi off. About 2 months later, she calls me up and she wants to do another podcast. I didn't believe what you were saying, she said. It was actually interfering with my husband's and my sleeping because I had these devices all around me in my bedroom. So they really do affect you. And there's a lot of anecdotal as well as scientific evidence that talks about the importance of those minimized exposures.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Now, the other things that are going on in the house, I mean, I think in the book, what is it? The things that measure the amount of electricity the hydro that you're using, you've got all these other devices. Is there anything we do about those, or do we just kind of have to live with all those kind of around?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question, particularly as it relates to smart meters. People are panicking about a smart meter is the strength, 3/4 of the strength of a cell phone transmission. Yeah. And it's periodic, and people panic. But remember, if it's on your garage wall and there's a 20-foot garage space between you and the bedroom or you and the living quarters, there's nothing to worry about. The distance is protecting you. So keeping devices like that away is probably the best thing you can do. Having a meter and walking around the room with any form of meters can tell you, boy, you're in trouble. But you don't need a meter to tell you that. All you got to do is look for the sources. When you have a Roku watching TV that uses a Wi-Fi connection, connect it with an Ethernet. When you have your laptop or your computer Wi-Fi, connect it to an Ethernet plug. When you're using a laptop, I don't use a laptop close to me. I actually have it away from me, and I connect to a monitor and an auxiliary keyboard for my protection. Simple little things like that is really all you need to worry about. And a meter is going to say you got trouble, and the only thing you can really do is move stuff, turn them off. And so, in my opinion, you're spending money you don't need if you're diligent about finding the sources in your house.
Yeah. The more you talk, the more you realize how many things are devices and how many things are connected around the house. It's actually,
and they have these refrigerators that tell you they need more food through the Wi-Fi. You don't really necessarily need that for your environment. You know what I mean?
Go look in the fridge, see if you need more food.
Right.
So, I mean, there's a lot of people that all day when you're at work, you're either on your phone or you're on your laptop. So,
Right.
I mean, moving it or staying away from it isn't really possible, I guess, for a lot of people, because
Right.
that's just the way of life now for our jobs. The devices that you created for your sons that you talked about in the beginning, do these help? Does it block all of the EMF? Does it block all the different types of EMF? Can you sort of talk about how that works, and if this is something that may be the future for us, if we're going to be using all these devices?
Yeah. Remember when I mentioned that the signal is omnidirectional? It goes in all directions.
Yeah.
By the way, I'm like you. I'm not going to put my cell phone down and not use it because it's going to damage me. I'm going to manage it. And there are a couple of ways I can do that by moving it away from me oftentimes. And then, of course, I have products that shield the signal that's on one side, taking that omnidirectional signal and not even allowing it to move in one direction, but allow it to move in another direction. Very simple device in theory. There are ways of shielding the signals from your body, and that in combination with good management of your environment. By the way, is it probably a good time to talk about how to remember all these details? I talk about it as bees in the room. One bee won't kill you, 1,000 will. So the idea is to find out where all the bees are in the room and just turn them off, redirect them, put them under wire. And when you're minimizing the number of bees in that room, you're improving your health. Something we haven't spoke about is hypersensitivity, electrohypersensitivity. We know that, like multiple chemically sensitivity, which you may be aware of, there is a growing serious problem with hypersensitivity, where you can't even go close to a laptop or a cell phone because the transmissions are bothering you. It tingles your hands. You get disrupted easily. You heat up really fast when it turns on. And so hypersensitivity is a growing concern in our environment as a result of these exposures. So it is very important for those, particularly women, by the way. 20% of the population is hypersensitive right now,
20%?
currently.
Wow.
Yeah, 20%. By the way, for multiple chemical sensitivity as well. And it's growing. And so that, of that 20%, 80% of women. And we know that it actually gets worse before it gets better. So it's really, really important to manage your environment, particularly if you're hypersensitive. That's one of the things I really push, not just because you're going to be safe and you're not going to know it. You can't smell it, you can't see it, you can't feel it, most of us, but it can be dangerous. And there are indicators with hypersensitivity that can get really pretty serious.
So the big things, the important things to remember is to get some distance from your devices, to manage them. So turn a bunch of them off if you can, or turn them off whenever you have the ability to. And if you can't, then you can sort of block them. And that's the company that Dan has started is called Defender Shield. I'll leave a link in the show notes so you can check out those products. Is there a lot of companies that are doing these? Can you get them anywhere? Are they all made the same?
Funny. Well, I actually started this stuff when actually no one seemed to care whatsoever. There are a couple of companies now that are in this business, and so there are choices that a consumer can make. We happen to have a laundry list of products for all devices that are near the body. We're even coming out with a blanket for pregnant women. Believe it or not, if you are exposed as a pregnant woman in the first part of the pregnancy from RF, you're 3 times more likely to have a miscarriage. So believe it or not, this stuff can get serious for all of us, including pregnant women. So we have a blanket we're coming out with very shortly. We have a variety of different cell phone cases, laptop cases, tablet cases. We have a bunch of those kinds of choices. And also, one thing we haven't talked about that actually is important to note is, because it's becoming more and more of a problem, we also have glasses that filter out Bluetooth, blue light.
Okay. Yeah.
The blue light is it's a visible light that's on the electromagnetic radiation spectrum. And as humans, we've seen it our whole lives, and all our previous predecessors, and everyone will. It's part of our environment. The blue light component is very, very close to being called ionized radiation. When you go to get an X-ray at the dentist, and they put something in your mouth, they throw this really heavy thing on top of you. They rush into the other room. You hear a button being pushed, and they look out and see if you're still there. And if you are, they come back. Why are they worried? It's ionized radiation. Exposure to ionized radiation can disrupt the cell and mutate the cell almost instantly from the strength of the signal itself. So when you have blue light, it's getting close to be called ionized radiation. Non-ionized is all the stuff we've been talking about all day, non-ionized. But the borderline is blue light. So if you look at a screen, which is modern stuff just happening to us during the last 10 years, you stare at a screen, you stare at a cell phone, you stare at a TV, there is a blue light component hitting your eye. It's hitting the retina. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Here are a couple of things we know. Through research, we know that you can have premature macular degeneration. So your eye can deteriorate as a result of that blue light component. And these are scientific research studies, by the way. And let's say you have dry eye. You're going to the doctor and he's saying, take these drops of stuff and your eye will be okay. Well, the dry eye could actually be a result of the blue light exposure. So there is more and more concern that us looking at screens for such extended period of times, because of the blue light component, could be very dangerous to us. Wow. And so we have a product line strictly filtering out the blue component.
Interesting. I mean, I knew a lot about blue light in the sense that it sort of tricks your brain into thinking that the sun is still up, right? So it sort of delays your melatonin production. We've talked about that on the show before, and talked about wearing blue light blocking glasses, at night to help you sleep.
Right.
I didn't realize it was also a form of radiation. That's it
scary. Is. That's literally what it is. And by the way, what you were referring to at night, it's the circadian rhythm that is screwing around with. And that there is a subtending bunch of stuff that's bad as a result of you not getting that rhythm correct for your life.
So it seems that we've really screwed up our technology in these devices. I don't know if you know, but is there any technology that's out there that's on the rise that, is a phone or some sort of device that doesn't emit as much radiation or any radiation? Like, is there any sort of technology that's out there yet? Do we have any hope? Or are we just...
There are. They're looking at optical connections, which is line of sight connections, where it's using light patterns to connect from one thing to another. And that essentially eliminates the RF. And so there are those kinds of things. But in contrast to that, there are those things that are occurring. I mentioned 5G a moment ago. And 5G is up to 300 gigahertz. At 90 gigahertz, it's called what do they call it? It's a device used to crowd control. And what it does is it hits your skin. Your skin acts as an antenna with the sweat glands, and it absorbs it. And all of a sudden, you get really, really hot, and you run. Well, that's at 90 gigahertz. And so we have 5G coming about, which is between 2 and 300 gigahertz. And we know that that exposure potentially can be a continuing trend of excess health danger as a result of those exposures. So there's that you got to manage. But on the other hand, there are technologies that are beginning to come out that may help offset all those negative things that are going on in the technology.
Well, hopefully they come a little bit sooner than we hope.
I mean, it's actually pretty serious stuff.
For sure.
And one thing I didn't mention, when you have exposures like that, there's not just the emissions to the cell, but your immune system actually reacts to it as well. We know from research from Dr. Ali Johansson is that not only is it damaging potentially to the cell, but your whole immune system is suppressed. And so if you have a reduced system for these kinds of things, where you have you have leaky gut, for example, and leaky gut is the source of your emission, your response to the environment, the toxic environment. And so when those kinds of things are all disrupted, you're actually more susceptible as a result of that. So you really want to make sure that there's not just the external things you're worried about, but also the internal. So there's not just the body response from the gut. By the way, there are 10 times more bugs in your gut than there is cells in your body, to give you an idea of how important that is. And I think you may know those kinds of those facts. So it's really important that you have a good gut. The other thing you also need, and this is actually up your alley a little bit too, is our foods. 100 years ago, lettuce, not lettuce, what do you call it? Popeye used to eat it.
Spinach.
Spinach had 180 milligrams of iron in it. If you look today, it has like 5 milligrams. So the minerals within our body are been disrupted over the last 50 years or so. And as a result of that, we have deficiencies in our mineral content. So you really want to start looking at ways of looking at bringing health within the body. And there are a lot of products available to sort of look at those kinds of things. So you maintain your ability to suppress and deal with these environmental toxins in our environment.
That's a good point too. I mean, you're not going to be able to protect or prevent all the EMF that's coming out, that's coming onto you. But if you can eat healthy and just be a healthy individual, you're going to be able to fight those effects a little bit better. So just another reason to really take care of yourself and take care of your health. Is there anything, before I have a couple last questions for you, but is there anything that we missed that you need to make sure that people hear about EMF?
We were talking about the time continuum of technology, and we talked about 5G a little bit.
Yeah,
but we never talked about 1 through 4G. It may help to understand what was going on. When the standard was developed over 30 years ago, it was based on an analog signal. An analog signal is a constant waveform. Here's an analogy. If I take a steel bar and I put it into a piece of concrete and I put 10,000 pounds onto that steel bar and it's a constant load, it won't break. When I take a steel bar and I put it on a piece of concrete and I lift that 10,000 pounds up and I drop it down, lift it up, drop it down, the concrete breaks. Why is that important? Well, 1G was an analog constant load. 2 to 4G is a digital load. It's on, off, on, off. So we know when we change the algorithms in communicating back and forth in the technologies that, in fact, it's more dangerous to the cell than when it was at constant load as an analog signal. Here comes 5G. 5G is not only up to 300 gigahertz, but it also has 2 sets of data within the carrier. It's called MIMO, multiple in, multiple out. And so now we have 2 jackhammers that are hitting the cell. And as a result of that, there could potentially be more danger to the cell, given we know that the evolution from analog to digital, we saw a change in how the cell deals with it to the 5G, which is now double. So when you use caution, you really want to pay a lot of attention to when you use 5G.
Wow.
Which is in your environment next year, actually, next year.
Is it next year? It's coming 2019?
Yeah. Yeah. They're actually trialing it already.
So it seems like, they're just going to, the companies, the corporations are just going to keep coming out with these better technologies. And I mean, it's kind of what the consumer wants, because at the moment they don't know the health impacts to it. For those of us who have listened to this podcast and understand, the consequences or the risks, is there anything that we can do? Is there anything that we can do to sort of help, or where are we at with this? Like, what can we do to kind of band together and make a difference here?
I tend not to like to go into the political space, but it's clear that needs to be taken. I'll give you an example. I work with a neurologist out in Washington State, and he called me up one Saturday morning. He said, "I got this splitting headache. What's going on in my environment?" And he had just moved into the cottage that he had bought, a remote cottage. And I said, "Go look at the router." And he went and looked at it, and it was a 5G router. Mm. So he turned it off. 2 hours later, all his headaches went away. So he's a believer that there could be some potential dangers, and certainly there are transient dangers that he has to worry about. So he had a cell tower that was being installed in his area, and the town wanted to approve or deny it. And so what he did was he went down to the town and he shared his experience. So there's really literally get part of your local municipalities and sort of lobby for what you think is the right answers. We know that there are beginning to be others who are lobbying at the higher levels. But all those are nice and good. 10 years from now, they'll still be fighting these arguments potentially. Yeah. And really, so it's a matter of making sure you own your environment. Like you don't want multiple volatile organic compounds because you have chemicals that doesn't have a cap in the bedroom. You want to cap it. Same thing here. Manage your environment. Those are the best things you can do. In time, we'll see what prevails. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So if someone wants to continue to learn about the advances of EMF and kind of where things are going, do you guys have any resources? I mean, obviously Radiation Nation, if you want to, really dive into it, pick up that book, really interesting read. But do you guys have like somewhere that you continue to put out information, or is there anything that we can keep learning?
So let's talk about the book a little bit. What prompted me to write the book and my son? We were frustrated. That research was really solid, yet the layperson didn't know anything about it. Mm-hmm. And for that matter, didn't even know what it was. So we set out a few years ago to help moms, grandmas, lay people who don't necessarily understand this rather technical stuff, and try to give it to them in a way that they understand it. That's why we wrote Radiation Nation. Irony of all ironies, I had researchers from I mentioned Ollie Johansson, Dr. Ollie Johansson. He actually wrote us and said, my God, I learned something. And he's been doing electromagnetic radiation study work for 30 years.
Mm.
What we knew was the research wasn't talking to the physicians community. The physicians community wasn't talking to the layperson about these subjects. So that's why we wrote the book. To keep current, we have on our website articles we write all the time on what's current, what's going on in the environment around us, as well as with Facebook. If you go to Facebook, we post almost every day of what's going on in the environment and who's arguing with who, what new data do we know. So we constantly keep that updated. And then to go more deep, we have a learning section within our website, a very extensive library, research library. We don't cite conjecture and hearsay. We cite research study work that's been bona fide and properly operated. And we keep a whole literature base there. So if you want to investigate a little bit about ADHD and the link to EMF, you can find it. So we have that library of data that can be helpful for everyone at defendershield.com.
Awesome. Well, Dan, I don't have any other questions, but I just want to first say thank you for joining us here and explaining all this this interesting information, and also say thank you for all the work that you guys are doing. This is definitely an important issue, and it's probably going to be one of the bigger, issues of our time, I think, similar to the way that smoking and that was. So, we need people like you guys who are sort of getting after it and tackling it head on. So, thank you for that, and thank you for sharing all this. So, I don't know if there's anything else that you wanted to add, but really appreciate you coming on here.
Well, I really appreciate you asking me to your show, because it helps us bring some messaging to those who need to listen to it. This data, it turns out women are more affected than men. Women, mothers, grandmothers. It's really important that we find a path to get people at least to have a sense and argue intelligently one side or the other. And hopefully through the work you're doing, inviting me and other things we're doing will be effective. Thank you so much again for inviting me. I really do appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, Dan. Well, you take care.
Thank you.